What happens when the city's most ruthless man catches a lowly maid breaking his one absolute rule? Dominic Rossi's twin daughters hadn't slept in months since their mother's tragic murder. But when a desperate maid did the unthinkable, she didn't just risk her life to change the criminal underworld forever. The Rossi estate sat on a sprawling, secluded cliffside just outside the city limits, a fortress of iron gates, high stone walls, and armed guards patrolling the perimeter in the dead of night. To the outside world, Dominic Rossi was a legitimate real estate magnate, a man whose wealth was as vast as his political connections. But within the shadowed whispers of the city's underbelly, he was the undisputed head of the Rossi syndicate. He was a man who commanded loyalty through fear, whose mere name could silence a crowded room. Yet, for all his terrifying power, Dominic was entirely helpless against the ghosts that haunted his own home. 10 months ago, a rival family had crossed a line that the old codes of the Mafia had explicitly forbidden. A car bomb, intended for Dominic, had instead taken the life of his beloved wife, Natalia. Dominic had survived, but he was left a hollowed-out shell of a man, consumed by a thirst for vengeance that he had exacted with brutal, horrifying precision. The rival family was eradicated, their names wiped from the streets. But all the blood in the world couldn't bring Natalia back, nor could it heal the profound psychological wounds inflicted upon the only light left in his dark world. His 5-year-old twin daughters, Lily and Mia. The girls had been in the house when the explosion shattered the driveway. They had felt the shockwave, heard the deafening roar, and seen the immediate, bloody aftermath before security could shield their eyes. Since that day, Lily and Mia had not slept through the night. Their insomnia wasn't merely a difficulty falling asleep. It was a nightly descent into pure terror. The moment the sun dipped below the horizon, a paralyzing anxiety gripped the twins. By midnight, the sprawling mansion would echo with their blood-curdling screams. They suffered from severe night terrors, thrashing in their beds, crying out for a mother who would never answer. Dominic had tried everything. He had flown in the most prestigious pediatric sleep specialists from London and Switzerland. He had hired a revolving door of elite nannies, paying them exorbitant sums, only to fire them when they inevitably failed to soothe the girls. The doctors prescribed mild sedatives, but Dominic, fiercely protective and distrustful of chemicals clouding his daughters' minds, forbade their use. The estate fell into a grim, exhausting routine. The staff walked on eggshells, perpetually sleep-deprived themselves, terrified of Dominic's notoriously short temper. The mansion, with its vaulted ceilings and imported Italian marble, felt less like a home and more like a beautifully decorated mausoleum. Enter Ilara Jenkins. Ilara was 23, fiercely resilient and entirely desperate. She didn't care about the rumors surrounding the Rossi family. She didn't care that the previous 3 maids had quit in tears within a week. All Ilara cared about was the envelope of cash she would receive every Friday, money she desperately needed to keep her younger brother, Leo, in a private medical facility. Leo was battling a severe autoimmune disease, and the crushing weight of the medical bills had driven Ilara to the brink. When an agency offered her double the standard rate to work at a private, high-security residence, she had signed the non-disclosure agreements without a second thought. On her first day, Sylvia Hastings, the stern, rigid head housekeeper, whose face seemed permanently etched in a scowl, cornered Ilara in the industrial-sized kitchen. "Let me make this perfectly clear, Miss Jenkins," Sylvia snapped, her cold eyes dragging over Ilara's standard-issue grey uniform. "You are here to clean the floors, polish the silver, and remain entirely invisible. Mr. Rossi does not wish to see you, nor does he wish to hear you." "I understand, Mrs. Hastings," Ilara replied softly, keeping her gaze respectfully lowered. "More importantly," Sylvia continued, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "you are never, under any circumstances, to set foot in the East Wing. That is the private residence of Mr. Rossi and his daughters. If you hear them crying at night, you will ignore it. If you see a nanny running down the hall in a panic, you will look the other way. You do not intervene. You do not cross that threshold. The last girl who thought she could play savior was thrown out the front gates at 3 in the morning without her coat. Do we have an understanding? Yes, ma'am. I won't go near the East Wing. For the first 2 weeks, Ilara kept her word. She scrubbed the mahogany floors until her knuckles ached, polished the antique chandeliers, and faded into the background whenever Dominic Rossi's towering, intimidating figure swept through the grand foyer, flanked by men with broad shoulders and concealed weapons. Dominic was a terrifying presence, tall, dressed in immaculate dark suits, his jaw perpetually clenched, his eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. But it was the nights that broke Ilara's heart. Her small servants' quarters were located on the 3rd floor of the West Wing, yet the mansion was so quiet at night that sound carried perfectly. Around 2 in the morning, the screaming would begin. It wasn't the sound of spoiled children throwing a tantrum. It was the raw, primal sound of absolute terror. Ilara would lie awake, staring at her ceiling, her chest aching. She thought of her own brother, of how she used to hold him when his pain was too much to bear. The idea of those 2 little girls, trapped in their own minds without their mother, clawed at her empathy. She watched as yet another high-paid, credentialed nanny, a stern woman named Beatrice, lasted only 3 days. Beatrice would emerge from the East Wing looking haggard, muttering about how the girls were impossible and beyond help. Ilara kept her head down. But the tension in the house was becoming unbearable. Dominic's temper was fraying. The guards were on edge. A dark cloud of exhaustion and despair hung over the Rossi estate, heavy and suffocating. Ilara knew the rules. She knew the consequences. She needed this job to save her brother's life. But Ilara Jenkins had a fatal flaw. She could never turn her back on a child in pain. And the storm that was brewing outside the mansion was nothing compared to the storm that was about to break inside it. The night everything changed began with a violent drop in barometric pressure, a massive summer thunderstorm, typical for the region but unusually ferocious, rolled in off the coast. By midnight, the sky was a bruised, violently churning purple, and rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the mansion's towering windows. Thunder cracked like artillery fire, shaking the very foundations of the estate. For the twins, it was the worst possible trigger. The concussive booms of the thunder sounded exactly like the car bomb that had ripped their world apart. From her small bed in the servants' quarters, Ilara sat bolt upright. The screaming tonight wasn't just crying, it was hysterical. Hyperventilating panic. It echoed through the ventilation shafts, raw and desperate. Ilara checked her cheap wristwatch. It was 2:15 a.m. She waited, expecting the new night nurse, a timid woman, hired just yesterday to soothe them. But 10 minutes passed, and the screams only grew louder, accompanied by the sound of shattering glass. Ilara slipped out of bed, pulling her thin robe over her pajamas. She crept down the back staircase, her bare feet silent on the cold stone steps. When she reached the second-floor landing that divided the west and east wings, she froze. The new night nurse was standing in the hallway, weeping hysterically, clutching her packed suitcase. "I can't do it." The nurse sobbed to a heavily armed guard standing near the double doors of the east wing. "They're throwing things. They're inconsolable. I'm not trained for psychiatric trauma of this level. I'm leaving." "You can't leave now. The boss is in the basement, securing the perimeter with the capos because of the storm," the guard hissed, looking panicked. He said under no circumstances is he to be disturbed unless we're under attack. "Then let him fire me," the nurse cried, pushing past the guard and practically running down the grand staircase. The guard cursed, running a hand over his face. He looked toward the east wing doors, clearly conflicted. He was a soldier, a Mafia enforcer, not a babysitter. He couldn't go in there and calm 2 hysterical 5-year-olds. Ilara stood in the shadows. Sylvia's warning rang in her ears. "You do not intervene. You do not cross that threshold. If she was caught, she wouldn't just be fired. She would lose the money Leo needed for his treatments. She could be blacklisted. Or worse, Dominic Rossi was not a man constrained by the law. Another crack of thunder shook the house. A fresh, agonizing shriek tore from the east wing. Ilara stopped thinking. Her maternal instincts, forged by years of raising her sick brother, violently overrode her sense of self-preservation. Before the guard could turn back around, Ilara darted from the shadows, slipped past his blind spot, and pushed through the heavy oak doors into the forbidden east wing. The hallway was dimly lit, the walls lined with portraits of a beautiful, dark-haired woman, Natalia. Ilara followed the sounds of crying to the grandest set of doors at the end of the hall. She pushed them open. The nursery was in shambles. Books were thrown across the floor. A lamp was shattered, and huddled together in the furthest corner, tucked behind a massive velvet armchair, were Lily and Mia. They were trembling violently, their knees pulled to their chests, hands clamped over their ears. Ilara didn't hesitate. She didn't treat them like fragile, broken porcelain dolls, as the doctors and nannies had. She dropped to her knees, completely ignoring the shards of glass biting into her skin, and crawled into the small space behind the chair with them. "Hey," Ilara whispered, her voice surprisingly steady and warm. "Hey, it's okay. It's just the sky being grumpy." Mia, the smaller of the two, looked up, her eyes wide and bloodshot. Loud, she hiccuped. "I know," Ilara said, slowly extending her arms. "But it can't get in here. I promise." She gathered both girls into her arms. They were stiff at first, terrified of a new touch. But Ilara's embrace was different. It wasn't clinical. It was purely comforting. But the thunder struck again, and the girls began to thrash. Ilara knew she needed to change their environment. She needed to break the cycle of panic. She scooped them both up, grunting slightly at the combined weight of the two 5-year-olds, and carried them out of the nursery. She walked down the private hallway, looking for a distraction. At the very end of the corridor was a door sealed with a heavy brass padlock. Ilara knew what this room was. The staff whispered about it. It was Natalia's private conservatory and music room. Dominic had locked it the day she died and strictly forbade anyone from entering. It was a shrine. "I'm already breaking the rules," Ilara thought, her heart hammering against her ribs. Might as well go all the way. Ilara had grown up in a rough neighborhood. She knew how to bypass a simple padlock. Digging a heavy hairpin from her messy bun, she jiggled the lock. With a satisfying click, the heavy brass lock gave way. She pushed the door open. The air inside smelled faintly of dried lavender and old paper. The room was beautiful, filled with dead, dried plants that used to be vibrant. And in the center stood a magnificent white grand piano. Ilara sat on the piano bench, resting the girls on her lap. The storm raged outside, but in this sealed room, it felt distant. "Do you know," Ilara murmured, rocking them gently, "when my brother was scared of the dark, my grandmother used to sing a special song to him. She said it was magic. It chased the loud noises away." Ilara's grandmother had been an Italian immigrant who lived in the apartment below them. Ilara had learned the language and the songs just by listening. She took a deep breath, praying her voice wouldn't shake, and began to sing. It was a soft, hauntingly beautiful lullaby, in fluent, flawless Italian. "Ninna nana, ninna o." She didn't know it, but she had chosen the exact song Natalia Rossi used to sing to her daughters every single night before the bombing. The effect was instantaneous. Lily and Mia went entirely rigid, their tear-streaked faces looking up at Ilara in absolute shock. For a terrifying second, Ilara thought she had made it worse. But then, as she continued the gentle melodic humming, the tension drained from their small bodies. The magic of the familiar, the sound of the mother tongue. The soft vibration of Ilara's chest, it wrapped around their fractured minds like a warm blanket. For the first time in 10 months, the girls closed their eyes without fear. Within 10 minutes, their breathing evened out. They were asleep. Deeply, peacefully asleep. Ilara sat there in the dark, tears of relief pricking her own eyes, continuing to hum softly, terrified to stop. She was so focused on the sleeping children that she didn't hear the heavy footsteps marching down the hallway. She didn't hear the panicked gasp of the guard outside. She didn't hear the door to the conservatory swing wide open. "Step away from my daughters." The voice was pure, lethal ice. Ilara's blood ran cold. She slowly turned her head. Standing in the doorway was Dominic Rossi. He was drenched in rain, his suit jacket discarded, his white shirt clinging to his broad chest. His eyes, usually dead and empty, were blazing with an unholy fury. And in his right hand, leveled directly at Ilara's chest, was a suppressed 9mm handgun. "I won't ask twice," Dominic hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger, his eyes locked on the broken padlock on the floor. "Put them down and step away." Ilara looked at the gun, then down at the two little girls sleeping peacefully against her chest. If she moved abruptly, they would wake up. They would see their father holding a weapon. The trauma would reset. Doing the unthinkable once more, Ilara met the eyes of the most dangerous man in the city, held her ground, and whispered, "No, if I move, they'll wake up." And they finally found peace. "So, you'll just have to shoot me, Mr. Rossi." For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the conservatory was the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass and the soft, even breathing of the two little girls nestled against Ilara's chest. Dominic Rossi did not blink. His grip on the customized 9mm was white-knuckled, the weapon perfectly leveled at Ilara's heart. He was a man who had ordered the executions of entire crime syndicates without a second thought. Violence was his native tongue, but as he stared at the young maid, a girl wearing a cheap, faded bathrobe over standard-issue cotton pajamas, he found himself paralyzed. His eyes darted from the broken padlock on the floor to Ilara's defiant, tear-filled eyes. And finally, to the faces of his daughters. Lily and Mia were asleep, not just resting their eyes, not tossing in the frantic throes of a night terror. They were deeply, profoundly asleep, their small fists curled softly into the fabric of Ilara's robe. The permanent lines of exhaustion and terror that had aged their 5-year-old faces for the past 10 months had vanished. "How?" Dominic whispered, his voice dangerously low, stripped of its usual booming authority. "How do you know that song?" Ilara swallowed hard, her throat dry with terror, but she kept her voice steady. "My grandmother. She was from Naples. She sang it to my little brother when the pain from his illness kept him awake. It always worked." Dominic's jaw clenched so hard Ilara thought the bone might snap. The song had been Natalia's. The last time he had heard that melody, his wife had been sitting at that exact Steinway grand piano, the sunlight catching her dark hair. To hear it now, coming from the throat of a stranger who had broken into his wife's sanctuary, felt like a desecration. And yet, the undeniable proof of its miracle was sleeping soundly in the girl's arms. Slowly, deliberately, Dominic lowered the gun. He didn't holster it, keeping it gripped in his hand, a silent reminder of the power dynamic in the room. "If you move from that spot before the sun comes up, I will kill you," Dominic stated, his tone devoid of any theatrical threat. It was simply a statement of fact. "If they wake up crying, you will answer to me." Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked out, closing the heavy door behind him. Ilara heard the sharp slide of a deadbolt, locking from the outside. She was trapped, but as she looked down at the sleeping twins, she let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned her head back against the piano. For the rest of the night, while the storm raged outside, Ilara held the girls, keeping them safe in a room built by ghosts. When the morning light finally broke through the conservatory windows, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. The deadbolt clicked open. Sylvia Hastings, the head housekeeper, stood in the doorway, her face pale and her lips pressed into a thin, terrified line. "The boss wants you in his study," Sylvia said, her voice shaking slightly. "Now, leave the girls." Elara gently untangled herself from Lily and Mia, who were still sleeping soundly on a plush velvet rug Elara had pulled down for them. She stood up, her body aching from sleeping in a rigid position all night, and followed Sylvia through the winding corridors of the Rossi estate. Dominic's study was a cavernous room, panelled in dark mahogany, smelling faintly of leather, expensive cigars, and danger. Behind a massive desk sat Dominic. In the daylight, Elara could see the dark circles under his eyes, the toll of his own sleepless nights. Standing by the window was Matteo, Dominic's underboss, a dangerously handsome man with slicked-back hair and a sharp, calculating gaze that made Elara's skin crawl. "Sit," Dominic commanded, gesturing to a leather chair opposite his desk. Elara sat, keeping her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Dominic picked up a manila folder from his desk and flipped it open. "Elara Jenkins, 23. No criminal record. Your parents passed away in a car accident 4 years ago, leaving you as the sole guardian of your younger brother, Leo Jenkins. Leo is currently a patient at Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan, suffering from a rare neuroimmunological disorder. You are drowning in roughly $200,000 of medical debt." Elara's heart plummeted. He had investigated her. Of course he had. The Mafia boss knew her greatest vulnerability. "Mr. Rossi, I apologize for breaking the rules," Elara started, her voice desperate. "I know I wasn't supposed to go into the East Wing, but the nurses left, and the girls were so scared." "Quiet," Dominic snapped, though the edge to his voice was less aggressive than the night before. He leaned forward, pouring a small measure of Macallan, 1 8-year-old Scotch, into a crystal glass. "The doctors told me my daughter's trauma was impenetrable. They told me it would take years of intense psychiatric therapy for them to ever sleep normally again. You fixed them in 10 minutes. It was just a song. It was my wife's song," Dominic corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "And you trespassed into a room that no one is allowed to enter." He took a slow sip of the scotch. "By all rights, Matteo here should be driving you to a very deep, very quiet part of the Pine Barrens right now." Matteo shifted by the window, offering Elara a chilling, empty smile. "But," Dominic continued, setting the glass down, "my daughters slept for 8 hours, and when they woke up 10 minutes ago, they asked for you." Elara blinked, stunned. "They did? Here is what is going to happen, Miss Jenkins," Dominic said, leaning back and steepling his fingers. "You are no longer a maid. You are now the personal, live-in caretaker for Lily and Mia. You will sleep in the East Wing. You will eat your meals with them. Whatever they need, you provide." "And if I refuse?" Elara asked, a spark of her natural defiance slipping out. Dominic's eyes darkened. "You don't have the luxury of refusal. But I am not an unreasonable man. In exchange for your absolute loyalty and silence, your brother's medical debts at Mount Sinai are wiped clean as of this morning. I have already arranged for Dr. Aris Thorne, the top pediatric neurologist in the country, to take over Leo's case. His treatments, his private room, his future, it is all paid for by the Rossi syndicate. He will live a long, healthy life." Elara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Tears immediately spilled over her cheeks. It was the miracle she had been praying for, the salvation her brother so desperately needed. However, Dominic's voice sliced through her relief like a razor. "You belong to this house now. You do not leave the estate without a security detail. You do not speak to anyone outside these walls. If you try to run, or if you betray me, The money for Mount Sinai stops. Instantly, do we have an understanding? It was a devil's bargain. She was trading her freedom, tying herself to a ruthless crime lord and a dangerous underworld to save her brother's life. Ilara looked Dominic dead in the eye, wiped her tears, and nodded. We have an understanding, Mr. Rossi. 3 months passed. The transformation within the Rossi estate was nothing short of miraculous. The heavy, suffocating gloom that had choked the mansion since Natalia's death began to dissipate. The change was entirely due to Ilara. She refused to treat the East Wing like a mausoleum. She opened the heavy velvet drapes, letting sunlight pour into the dusty corridors. She bought bright, colourful paints and sat on the floor of the nursery, letting Lily and Mia cover their hands in paint and press them against the walls. At night, there were no more screams. Ilara would sit by their beds, brushing their dark hair, softly humming the Neapolitan lullaby until they drifted into peaceful slumber. But the most shocking change was in Dominic Rossi, the ruthless, terrifying mob boss, a man who commanded legions of armed men, found himself finding excuses to return home early from his business meetings in the city. He would stand in the shadows of the hallway, watching Ilara play hide-and-seek with the twins in the grand foyer. He noticed the way Ilara's laugh echoed off the marble walls, a sound he thought he would never hear in his house again. He also noticed the way the light caught her amber eyes and the fierce, protective fire she carried herself with. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. When Dominic tried to discipline the girls too harshly for breaking a vase, Ilara had physically stepped between the 6'2" Mafia boss and the children, pointing a scolding finger at his chest and telling him to use his words, not his temper. To the absolute shock of the heavily armed guards standing nearby, Dominic hadn't executed her. He had actually apologized. The lines between employer and employee were blurring dangerously. Late one night, unable to sleep, Dominic had gone to the kitchen for a glass of water, only to find Ilara sitting at the island counter, hunched over a medical textbook, researching her brother's condition. He had sat across from her. For 2 hours, the ruthless head of the Rossi syndicate and the former maid talked in the quiet, dim light of the kitchen. Not about the Mafia, not about his dead wife, but about their favorite books, about Leo's progress at Mount Sinai, about Ilara's dreams, before the world forced her to grow up too fast. For a brief, fleeting moment, Dominic reached across the marble counter and gently brushed a stray lock of hair behind Ilara's ear. The electricity that arced between them was palpable, heavy with unspoken desire and profound loneliness. Ilara had stopped breathing, her eyes locked on his, realizing with a terrifying jolt that she was falling in love with a monster who was slowly proving he had a heart. But peace in the Mafia is only ever an illusion. A calm before a much deadlier storm. It happened on a Tuesday night. Dominic was away in the city, negotiating a volatile territory dispute with the Albanian factions. The house was quiet. Ilara had just put the twins to bed and realized she had left her favorite book in the estate's massive, subterranean laundry room earlier that day. She slipped quietly out of the east wing and descended the back stairs into the basement. The laundry room was vast, filled with industrial machines and shadows. Slid. As she retrieved her book from a folding table, she heard voices coming from the adjacent wine cellar. Normally, Ilara would have ignored it. The guards often played cards down here, but she recognized the smooth, venomous tone of the voice. It was Matteo, the underboss. Ilara froze, pressing her back against the cold concrete wall, holding her breath. "The Albanians are a distraction," Matteo was saying, his voice echoing slightly against the racks of vintage wine. "I leaked the shipment routes to them myself. Rossi will be tied up in negotiations until tomorrow morning." "Are we sure about this, boss?" another voice asked, rough, grating. Ilara recognized it as one of the perimeter guards, a man named Russo. "If Dominic finds out we planted that car bomb 10 months ago, he won't just kill us, he'll skin us alive." Natalia was just supposed to be a warning. Ilara's blood turned to ice in her veins. She clamped a hand over her own mouth to stifle the gasp clawing at her throat. Matteo. It wasn't a rival family who murdered Natalia Rossi. It was an inside job. It was Matteo, the man Dominic trusted like a brother, the man who ate dinner at their table. Dominic had eradicated an entire rival syndicate in a blind rage, completely unaware that the real snake was sleeping in his own house. Dominic is weak, Matteo sneered. The sound of a lighter flicking and a cigar catching filling the silence. He's lost his edge. Ever since that little charity case Maid moved in, he's playing house instead of running an empire. The commission in New York is losing patience. It's time for a change in management. What's the play? Russo asked. The annual charity gala is this Saturday. Dominic will be exposed, Matteo said coldly. But we don't just take him out. We have to break his lineage. No heirs, no loyalists rising up to avenge him. We hit the cars on the way to the gala. We take out Dominic. Matteo paused, and his next words made Ilara's heart stop completely. And then I'll send a cleanup crew here to the estate. We finish what we started 10 months ago. The twins and the maid don't survive the night. Ilara was trembling so violently she thought her knees would buckle. They were going to kill Lily and Mia. They were going to kill Dominic. She had to warn him. She had to get to a phone. Blind panic took over. Ilara took a step backward, intending to sneak back up the stairs. But in her terror, she didn't look down. Her foot caught the edge of a heavy metal laundry basket. It shifted with a loud, metallic screech against the concrete floor. The voices in the wine cellar instantly stopped. Who's out there? Matteo barked, the sound of a gun being drawn echoing in the basement. Ilara didn't think. She bolted. She abandoned stealth and ran toward the service elevator at the far end of the hall. Hey! Stop! Russo shouted, heavy footsteps pounding against the concrete behind her. Ilara slammed her hand onto the elevator button, praying to whatever god was listening. The doors opened immediately. She threw herself inside and mashed the button for the 3rd floor, just as Russo rounded the corner, his weapon raised. The metal doors slid shut a fraction of a second before a silenced bullet sparked against the steel frame. Ilara collapsed against the back wall of the elevator, gasping for air, tears of absolute terror streaming down her face. She had escaped the basement, but she was trapped in a house guarded by men taking orders from a traitor. She held the most dangerous secret in the criminal underworld. And Dominic Rossi, the only man who could stop it, was miles away in the city, and Matteo knew she was listening. The elevator dinged, arriving at the 3rd floor. Ilara knew she had less than 2 minutes before Matteo's men swept the house to silence her permanently. She had to save the twins, and she had to survive long enough to tell the widowed Mafia boss that the man who killed his wife was sitting at his right hand. The heavy metal doors of the service elevator slid open on the 3rd floor. Ilara didn't wait to see if Russo was taking the stairs. She sprinted. She abandoned the plush, carpeted main hallways and ducked into the narrow, unlit servant corridors that wove behind the mansion's walls like a secret nervous system. She knew these passages better than any guard. Her lungs burned as she reached the hidden access panel that opened into the east wing. She burst through, slamming the heavy deadbolts into place. She ran into the nursery. Lily and Mia were fast asleep, completely unaware that the nightmare that took their mother was marching up the stairs. "Girls, wake up," Ilara whispered fiercely, shaking them gently, but urgently. "We have to play a game, the quiet game. Right now." The twins rubbed their eyes, confused but trusting. Ilara didn't bother packing bags. She scooped Mia into her arms, grabbed Lily's hand, and rushed them down the hall, toward Dominic's master suite. 2 weeks ago, during one of their late-night talks in the kitchen, Dominic had given Ilara a 6-digit passcode. just in case the perimeter is ever breached when I'm not here," he had said. She pushed aside the massive oil painting in his walk-in closet, revealing the keypad to the estate's reinforced panic room. Her fingers flew over the keys. Green light flashed. The heavy steel door hissed open. She pushed the girls inside the small, heavily armored room. "Stay here. Do not make a sound," Ilara ordered, kissing both their foreheads. "Where are you going?" Lily whimpered. "I have to call your daddy." "I'll be right back." Ilara locked them inside and sprinted back into Dominic's study. The house's main phone lines were undoubtedly cut by Matteo's men. But Dominic had an encrypted satellite hardline on his desk that operated on an entirely independent grid. She picked up the heavy receiver and hit the speed dial for Dominic's personal cell. Ring. Ring. Downstairs, she heard the heavy crash of the East Wing doors being battered by a battering ram. Russo and Matteo's cleanup crew were inside the wing. Ring. Ring. Answer. Damn it. Ilara sobbed. Ilara? Dominic's voice finally clicked through the earpiece. The background noise was loud, the roar of his armored SUV speeding down the FDR drive toward the charity gala. "Dominic, listen to me. You have to turn the cars around," Ilara shouted, her voice breaking. "It's a trap. Matteo leaked your routes to the Albanians to distract you. He's going to ambush you at the gala." Silence stretched over the line for a terrible second. Then Dominic's voice returned, razor sharp. "How do you know this?" "I heard him in the cellar." "Dominic, it was Matteo who planted the car bomb 10 months ago. He killed Natalia. And right now, his men are breaking down the door to your study to kill me and the girls." The silence that followed was terrifying. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the absolute, chilling silence of a monster being unchained. "Are my daughters secure?" Dominic asked, his voice deadly calm. "In the panic room, but I'm in the study. They're in the hallway. Get under the desk, Ilara. Cover your ears." Before Ilara could ask what he meant, the line went dead. She dropped the phone, dove under the massive mahogany desk, and curled into a ball just as the study doors were kicked open. Heavy boots pounded against the hardwood floor. "Check the closets," Russo barked. "Find the maid." Suddenly, the deafening blare of the estate's emergency siren shattered the night. The sound was accompanied by the mechanical whir of the mansion's automated lockdown system. Heavy steel shutters slammed down over the windows. But it wasn't just a lockdown. Dominic had triggered the internal defense protocol from his phone. From her hiding spot, Ilara heard the distinct sound of the estate's loyal perimeter guards, men fiercely loyal to Dominic, completely separate from Matteo's inner circle flooding the East Wing. Gunfire erupted in the hallway. It was short, brutal, and utterly chaotic. Ilara squeezed her eyes shut, clamping her hands over her ears, praying the steel door of the panic room was holding. 10 minutes later, the gunfire ceased. The house fell into a deathly ringing silence. The voice wasn't Russo's. Ilara slowly peeked out from under the desk. Dominic stood in the doorway. He was still wearing his tuxedo, but his hands were covered in blood, and his eyes were wild, scanning the room frantically until they locked on her. He had abandoned his convoy, hijacked a motorcycle from a guard, and driven like a madman back to the estate, leaving his loyalists to execute the counter-ambush on Matteo in the city. Ilara crawled out from under the desk and ran to him. Dominic caught her, crushing her against his chest, burying his face in her hair. The untouchable, ruthless Mafia boss was shaking. "The girls," he breathed. "They're safe. They're in the room," Ilara cried, clinging to his lapels. Dominic pulled back, framing her face with his bloodied hands. "You saved them. You saved all of us." That night marked the end of the Rossi Syndicate in New York. The ambush on the FDR drive ended with Matteo's permanent disappearance. But Dominic had realized the ultimate truth. The underworld would always demand blood. and he refused to let his daughters or the woman who had brought his family back to life pay that price. 6 months later, the Rossi estate outside the city was sold to a corporate developer. On a sun-drenched terrace overlooking the sparkling blue waters of Lake Como, Italy, Ilara sat at a patio table, watching Lily and Mia chase butterflies through the expansive, heavily guarded gardens. A healthy, smiling Leo, fully recovered, thanks to the continued care of Dr. Aris Thorne and the Mount Sinai staff, was tossing a football with the guards on the lawn. Dominic stepped out onto the terrace, wearing a linen shirt, the dark circles finally gone from his eyes. He set 2 cups of espresso on the table and pulled Ilara into his lap, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. He was no longer the ruthless king of the underworld. He was just a father, a brother-in-law, and a man deeply in love with the maid who had done the unthinkable and saved his soul. From a desperate maid breaking the rules to the new matriarch of a reformed empire, Ilara proved that sometimes the biggest risks yield the greatest rewards. What did you think of Dominic's ultimate sacrifice for his family? If you loved this intense mafia romance story, hit that like button, share it with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired tales.